Hi everyone, I'm Federico. I'm a Vice President at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and with me are my colleagues.
Hi, I'm Amelia Brooks. I'm a Senior Director at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement.
And my name is Göran Henriks, coming from region Jönköping in Sweden.
So it's great to have you all here, and there are still people making their way in. And our session today is looking at leadership behaviors and what are the things that you need to do. Now, what I do at every session, and I'm just going to give you just a few seconds to do that, look to your right, look to your left, shake hands with the person that's there, you've made a new friend. So do that right away.
All sit.
Hey, Amelia.
Great. Now, why is that important? Well, you heard the IHI motto is all teach, all learn, and we're all here to learn together. We're all here to teach each other. So although we're up here on the stage and we're going to share our experiences and what we know, many of you have your own experiences and your own best practices, your own behaviors that you've modified to build a culture of safety. I guess in going there, first, before we have disclosure, we have nothing to disclose, no conflict of interest. We don't intend to endorse any products. That's not what we do. What we need to do first, though, is I ask you to reflect a moment. And I ask you to reflect on what do you mean when you talk about a culture of safety? What does that mean to you? So just take a moment and reflect. So there are many definitions out there around a culture of safety. AHRQ, which is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in the United States, has brought together what their definition is, and they call it a safety culture of an organization is the product of individual and group values, attitudes, perceptions, and competencies, and the patterns of behavior. So again, we have the first element of what we're talking about today. It's many things, it's not just one thing, but we believe very strongly that it's the behaviors that begin to shape the culture. Also, organizations with a positive safety culture are categorized by communications founded on mutual trust. And we'll talk about the importance of why trust is necessary and foundational to all the work that we do. However, we know that there are many things that contribute to a safety culture, as we said, and there's psychological safety, and it's a real, I guess, consultant term. What does that mean? Well, psychological safety means people have trust in each other, they're able to speak up, they're able to ask questions, never feel that somebody's going to put them down for asking a question, or when they're concerned about a patient, being able to challenge someone to say, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do, let's be sure that we're safe. It is a culture where there's transparency, and transparency means that we share information. Not only do you put up your run charts and share your work to date, but it's also the ability to be transparent with each other, to be able to share with each other opportunities for doing better, opportunities where we already are doing great, and being able to do that in a way that is productive and always patient-centered. And of course, it takes teamwork. And teamwork doesn't happen unless you have a culture of safety and psychological safety doesn't happen unless you have teamwork. So there's so many intertwining pieces to do that it becomes important to figure that out. Others have said that culture is really what you do when no one is looking. So if you think about hand hygiene, everybody got hand hygiene conquered? Anybody? 100%? Yeah, well, thank you. It's not going to happen that easily. But the practice is we use secret shoppers, or we watch someone to observe. Well, usually if you know you're being observed, you're going to follow the rules. But what happens when no one is watching? Do you still follow the rules? Do you still do what's expected of you? Because that is the culture that you have. Whether you are driving a car and don't stop at the stop sign or the red light, because remember, many of the things we do in life are because we agree they're the right things to do. There are no hard stops. There are nothing that forces us to do that. But it's the opportunity of behaving in a way that supports our values to it is what we want to do. And also, we have to have trust. And without that trust, and our experience is that as we've gone to many organizations, when we start discussing the issues that are going on, the behaviors and everything else, one of the things we find is a lack of trust. And if you don't have that trust, it doesn't work. Now let me introduce you to our framework. Some of you may be familiar with it. This is our framework for safe and reliable care, but you can take off safe and reliable and effective and just call it the framework for any quality improvement effort. We tend to focus on safety, patient safety, but we can do it for anything at all. And there are two components to this framework. One is called culture and one is called learning systems. Now, much as Don and Maureen spoke earlier, when we started our safety work, when I started our safety work, I believed that if we standardized everything, if we put bundles in place, if we make sure that people knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing, that everything would be safe. And I found out very quickly that it wasn't sustainable, because although we had standardized processes, there was nothing really there that held people accountable to it other than punishment. There was nothing there that allowed people to speak up when they didn't agree that that was the right thing to do and it might hurt the patient. There was no transparency of people sharing with each other behaviors and experiences they were doing. And we learned over time at IHI, with all the work that we did, as well as with our Patient Safety Executive Development Program and work around the world, working with Amelia, working with Göran and many others, that it's really more complex than just putting in a system. That it really is developing that culture that supports the work that you're doing. And so this framework is our view of all the elements that are necessary in order to become a successful program. So if all the work that we learned about in Scotland, it wasn't just because they did that bottom part, the learning system. It was because of the culture and the behaviors that they affected to make that happen. In the middle of our circle is engaging patients and families. And we are going to change that because it's really engaging patients, family, and staff. You will hear me say more often than not, if you've developed a safe system, but you haven't made it more effective, more efficient, more equitable, more patient-centered, more timely, you really haven't done your job. Because our job is not to make it more complicated for people. Our job is really to make it easier for patients, and also easier for staff to do their right work. As we go through the framework, we're going to focus on the culture part today, and in particular the leadership component. And I want to emphasize that leadership is leadership at every level of the organization. Every one of us is a leader in our own way. We may have a title, we may have a position. However, there are people who, because they are well respected, because they just work with people and everybody watches them, they're leaders as well. And their job is to behave in a way that supports the values. Their job is to protect the learning system that we can all learn from each other, and their job is to encourage psychological safety and encourage teamwork. We then also have psychological safety. Well, it's foundational, and again, as I said, what is psychological safety? Well, it's again part of safety. It's part of that trust, part of that ability to speak up and communicate with each other. We then go on and we have issues like accountability. Now, in the English language, accountability, especially in the United States, has a negative connotation. And I shared this with a group of physician leaders from around the world, and there were two psychiatrists in the room, and they said, please don't use the word accountability, because it's a turnoff. We don't like that. It means negative. What we mean by accountability, and you can change that to responsibility, you can change it to your role, you can change it to whatever you want, is that we should hold each other accountable to do our job. The things that we're supposed to do for patients, because that's why we're in this work, that we can say to each other, Frank, you didn't do proper hand hygiene before you walked into that room. And step up to each other and say that boldly. Or Frank, you're not using the protocol that we decided we would be using. And of course, we're not going to use it if it's going to harm the patient, but are we able to speak up to each other and hold each other accountable? The work on hand hygiene, I think, is so important, because if you want to stop the spread of infections, you start right there to stop the spread of infections. But in order to improve hand hygiene, we go through these elaborate gyrations, we go back to what Dawn said, we do all this measurement stuff. I think nothing will change hand hygiene more than ensuring you have proper hand gel, ensuring the sinks are working, and most importantly, holding each other accountable when things go wrong. The other aspect of accountability is that sometimes bad things do happen. And it's unfortunate, but that's why we're here. We're trying to prevent those bad things from happening. And what really becomes important is then to understand, how do we judge the people involved when something bad happens? And we call it a fair and just culture. And a lot of the work, and Amelia is leading some of that work now at IHI, we always tend to look at it from the negative perspective rather than trying to use it as a learning opportunity to figure out how can we do it better. Because we always start with, well, who's at fault? Why were they involved in this? As opposed to saying, did we set up our people to make those mistakes? Did we put them in a position where anybody would have failed the same way? Next, as we go on, is looking at teamwork and communication. Teamwork is people working together. Healthcare is not an individual sport. We all have to support each other. We all have to be there because each one of us brings something to the table. And when I talk about teamwork, there is the teamwork that happens, for example, in the intensive care unit or in the physician's office or the clinic. But teamwork is actually another way to look at it is the entire organization. When we were doing some work in Portugal, we visited a hospital, a cancer hospital, and when we went in there, we said, we're trying to prevent central line infections. And the chief medical officer said, well, that's going to be really hard for us because our patients are immunocompromised. They're cancer patients. And I said, so the expectation should be that if I come to your hospital, I will get a central line infection. And he was a little embarrassed by that. We went back later as we continued our work together, and they had reduced central line infections to the point where they had gone 3 months without a central line infection. And I looked at him, I said, well, not that long ago, you told me it wasn't possible. What did you do? He said, we developed teamwork because we went through everybody in the organization and made them understand how each one of them is necessary to reduce infections. Whether you're the person at the front door, whether you're the secretary, whether you're the person cleaning the room, whether you're the doctor, the nurse, the physio, or anybody else in the room. It is a team effort, and we all have to contribute to that. So teamwork isn't just the care team, but it could be everybody else that's involved in caring for that patient. Of course, the next area that we look at is what we call negotiations. And we say in negotiations because you oftentimes negotiate every day in your life, but you don't see it that way. In getting people to come on board, getting people to be part of your improvement efforts, getting people to understand what needs to be done, oftentimes is exactly that. It's a negotiation. Why are we here? We're here because we're here for the best interest of the patient. Now, you might substitute engagement, but I think negotiation is that other level of being able to communicate with each other in a way that allows you to come to a common ground, which is the best interest for the patient. That's our framework. And supporting all that is trust. Because unless we do that, none of those other elements will work. Now you're going to say, so Frank, why is this culture piece important? Can you show me evidence? Because it feels like it's yet another thing that we need to do. There was a study done in Michigan, and they were looking at central line infections and the work that they were doing. And what they did is they looked at culture and they categorized the different cultures results that they got into a low teamwork score culture, that is people who felt there's not a lot of teamwork, there was a medium score, and then there was somebody that high teamwork scores. And then they looked at outcomes. And what they found was the higher you were, the more you were on the right-hand side, the longer the period of time that patients went without an infection. So the correlation is that because they had good teamwork, because they had good communication, because they respected each other, because they held each other accountable, because they all did their work, they were actually able to improve care for the patient. So teamwork is not just about implementing that bundle. It's not just looking at the central line infection bundle and saying, here, everybody go do it, but it's really all the other components that go along with it to continue to support that. We talk about shaping culture. Before you start shaping culture, you need to understand the culture that you have. That is, you need to know, are our people resistant? Are people here afraid to try something new? Dawn talked about PDSAs. Are we afraid to do PDSAs? Are we afraid to look at the future in a different way? And remember, we're not trying to change your country culture or your regional culture. We're trying to change the culture of where you work. That is, what are the behaviors where we work together? There are a number of characteristics that are necessary for that. Things like making safety a core value, and that's what leaders do. Looking at strong leadership at all levels, that's what I said, you're all leaders. Establish organizational behavior that we say is necessary and we will follow. Ultimately, it's when you try to solve a problem, don't look at solving the symptom of the problem, but dig more deeply to understand. Because oftentimes, the root of the problem isn't necessarily the failure of that particular process, but maybe the failure of the culture to ensure that everybody is following that process. And ultimately, empower individuals. The people who do the work every day are individuals who are going to be able to tell you exactly how to do it. That's the introduction of the framework and the framing of culture. Now, my colleague Amelia and Göran are going to come and explain to you what some of those behaviors are that you need to exhibit in order to build a culture. And Göran is going to talk a little bit more about how healthcare is changing and how we need to have really a different view of the behaviors of leaders to move us into where healthcare is proceeding.
Thanks, Frank. So the framework that Frank has described is a theoretical framework. And I've been using it for many years. I used it before I worked with IHI when I was working in the NHS, and we were trying to lead work around improving safety and improving the quality of care. And we love a framework. It's fantastic to have something that acts as a lens that really brings together the cultural and the system and process components of what we're dealing with. I've found that to be incredibly helpful. I've also found it challenging to get to the practical steps around culture. And I think this is a common experience. So I'll tell you sort of briefly from my own history. My first 5 years or so working on improvement, it was all about the methodology. I can't tell you how many, I kind of dread to think how many driver diagrams I might have drawn in my time, how many PDSA cycles I might have done. And as I think about all of that time, technically, we were very, very sound in terms of what we were doing. But we were missing the hearts and minds piece. We were missing the culture, the behavioral piece. Gradually, I came across the science of human factors and started looking into that, and then we got some more into the sort of the cultural space. And I was at an organization that really started to accept that we might need to actually work on improving our culture if we really wanted the outcomes of care to be better, if we wanted the patient experience to be better, if we wanted our staff experience to be better. And so it was a conversation we started, and it led us to this question. And actually, it's still a question that lots of people are asking right now. So for Frank and I, was in our IHI roles, as we go around the world and we spend time with leadership teams, organizations, individuals, in programs where we're teaching people from all over the world together, this is one of the most common questions. We all know that we need a better culture. There's no such thing as a perfect culture. There's no such thing as a static culture. Culture is constantly changing over time. There are all kinds of micro-cultures that exist. The culture can change based on whether a different person walks into the room. That can flip those things in an instant. So there's no sort of gold at the end of the rainbow here. This is always going to be something that we're chasing after. But even once we have the acceptance of the need for this relentless pursuit of positive culture and behavior that supports safety, that supports improvement work, that supports psychological safety and innovation in the way that Frank described, what do we then do about it? So help me out. Raise your hands if your organization, your team thinks they probably need to be doing some work on culture or are doing some work on culture. Hands up high. It's very hard to see. Right, so we're all trying to work on culture. Let's talk about the things we might do. Have you got culture included in strap lines or vision statements? Hands up high. Quite a few hands. Do you have some kind of policy or strategy around culture? Hands up high. A few of those. Some people have behavioral guidelines that sort of talk about how we should treat each other, values that talk about respect and things like that. Hands up. Interesting. I guess my question is, how effective do we think those things are in changing culture? And it's a really tough question to ask, because they're the things that we're really good at doing. So I've been in organizations where we've written, I've probably spent months writing a strategy for the culture that we would like to have. I don't think it changed anything. It's a great document. It sat on a shelf, probably looked quite pretty, had lots of nice pictures, didn't change behavior. And so there's this practical bit that we need to get to, which is, what are we really trying to do? And how do we really manage to shift culture in our own organizations? And how do we move from what might be our normal responses to change to what might need innovative and completely different kinds of solutions if we're really going to do this in a way that's effective? So Edgar Schein is one of the sort of theorists behind a lot of the culture work, and I really like his framing of this, because his framing talks about the difference between the espoused values and what's really happening. So when Frank talked earlier about understanding culture, that's about understanding that difference. So I'll give you an example of an organization that Frank and I were in just a few months ago, where their vision statement said, excellent care every time for every patient. And when you ask the staff what's most important to people in this organization, the answer was money. So there's a difference between the values that we espouse and the behaviors that we exhibit. And as we seek to understand culture, we then start to ask a question about what is that difference? What's really going on here? Do we really treat each other in a way that matches our espoused values? And one of the common things there that we do, so the next step that a lot of people take on their sort of cultural journeys, is to start measuring culture. Now, I'm a huge fan of cultural measurement. I think it's a fantastic tool. I think the data isn't really important. I think the cultural measurement is the beginning of a conversation. It's an opportunity to have a conversation that you might not have ever had before. So lots of people then start measuring culture. And that measurement of culture will help you to understand what that gap might be in terms of those visible attributes, what people are really experiencing, compared to what's being espoused as the values of the organization. So understanding that gap is the first step. It's also true that your culture is, in simple terms, the worst behavior that you're willing to tolerate. So one of the components of the framework that Frank described is reliability. And reliability is as pertinent when you're talking about culture and behavior as it is when you're talking about system and process. So talking about the reliability of culture means that we get to say every single person on every single day feels safe to speak up, regardless of who they're with. And if you're working in an organization where you feel like people could say that, then that's fantastic, and the rest of us really want to learn from you. The reality is it changes all the time, and it can be very variable, and some places are really struggling with this. So the preparedness for this kind of conversation, where we start to really get into the depths of what is really going on, how are we treating each other when we come to work, how are we treating our patients and their families, how does the interaction between senior leaders and frontline staff happen, how does that feel for people? Those kinds of questions help us to understand what might be going on and what that gap might be. It's tough though, because there's another level of gap. So Chris Argyris talks about there are some things that we don't talk about, and doing something like a culture survey helps to bring some of those things to the fore. But then there are some things that we don't talk about not talking about, and that's even harder to get to. So it might have felt a little bit odd for us to introduce this framework that talks about a theoretical version of culture that we might be looking for, and a big learning system, and how those two things fit together, and how trust is the basis of all of that. But what we would say is that in our observations of working with different organizations, if you don't have trust, you can't do either of those things. And in the simplest terms, it means that without trust, people won't speak up and tell us what's really going on. So we won't get to those things that we don't talk about not talking about. And if we don't talk about the things that we don't talk about, then we don't know what we need to change. And that's why a lot of the solutions that we come up with are treating symptom and not cause. So the more trust we can create, the more depth we have in terms of our understanding of what's really going on, behaviorally and from a system and process perspective, and the more opportunity we have. So creating trust in simple terms means that people get to tell me their ideas and their innovations and their suggestions in a way that generates far more innovative solutions than we might ever have come up with before, but also is related to what's really going on, as opposed to what people think we might want to be told is going on. So trust really is the foundation to all of these conversations, and trust is absolutely fundamental to any improvement work you're looking to do. And again, worth just noting that the change is not necessarily a comfortable thing. We're hanging out here with 3,000 other people, all of whom love change, so change is a very comfortable thing in this setting. But for most people, change is not comfortable. So creating that trust and creating that atmosphere is a hugely important piece. And as we've worked with organizations, this list of observations is really just our feedback in terms of where you have a lack of trust, the impact that then has on the work that you're then able to do or not do. The next piece, I think, is the number of people that talk about they need to fix the culture. I don't know who they are. some mysterious group somewhere in the world, somewhere in an organization, locked in an office somewhere. But the reality is culture is your job, it's my job, it's our job every time we come to work. So the things that we talk about today are that's the exact same way that Frank and I behave when we're working together and when we're teaching together. We have to live and breathe these things ourselves. No amount of strategy or policy or senior leadership commitment is going to magically create trust or create positive culture. It relies on every single one of us understanding the potential for our own impact when we show up at work with the people over whom we have an influence. And that's why we talk about everyone as being leaders in their own right. Because if you come in a certain mood with a certain behavior set, you can create a great day for a lot of other people. It's also pretty easy to create the opposite as well. And so the piece here is really about focusing on, if I want to get to this gold at the end of the rainbow scenario where my organization can say globally, we have a positive culture, that means that I need to break it down into every single level that sits beneath that. And as I get further and further down, it gets to the individual. So it's an opportunity really, and I guess now an invitation for you all to reflect on what you do that helps to create a positive culture, what you do that creates trust for yourselves and for other people. And I think it's an interesting exercise just to perform, just because it's not the kind of thing we traditionally give people time to do. It's not a question that we really ask ourselves. And if we give you a second just to sit and reflect and think about your own behaviors, I can absolutely guarantee that every single one of you will be able to think of times when you go into work, behaviors that you exhibit that are great, that are valued by other people, that have a really strong influence and impact in a really positive way. And as you think of those things, I want you to celebrate them. I want you to show gratitude to yourselves, and when you go back, show them to your colleagues for the things that they do that help to make it a good day. And I'd also like us to be really candid and honest about the things that we do that sometimes don't make it a great day. I'll give you a personal example from myself. I really love to be busy. I travel a lot for work. The busier I get, the more excitable I get. I am a redhead. It comes with the territory. The more excitable I get, the faster I talk. And the faster I talk, the harder it is for someone else to make a suggestion or stop me and say they don't understand. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to create that culture. I'm just behaving in a way that comes naturally to me that could be, and is, at times, having a negative influence on other people. So behaving in a way that might negatively influence culture doesn't mean it's intentional, but I still need to be aware of the impact that that might be having. And so the invitation for all of you here is to really just take a moment to reflect on what those things are and think about what you can do more of and what you can do less of. Because if we really are going to create the kinds of cultures that Frank described in terms of the cultural half of our framework, if we're going to create psychological safety and accountability for behaviors within a fair and just culture, if we're going to have good teamwork and communication, if we're going to make decisions in a way that's properly based on negotiation and is comfortable for everyone involved, and if we're going to have all of that modeled by people throughout the system in a very reliable way, it starts with us. So that reflection, I think, is a really important exercise. It's also important because of these kinds of quotes. You can't give away what you don't have. So Maya Angelou said, "I don't trust people who don't love themselves, but say I love you." And that might feel a little touchy-feely to some of you, but the reality is, if you don't understand this yourself, you can't be expecting of it from other people. If you're not willing to do this yourself, you can't expect your leaders to do that for you. So this is the invitation to really focus on this at the individual level. So putting yourselves at the center of all of this means that we start to focus on, well, how do I, as the first step, how do I create trust? What do I do that lets people know that they can trust me? And what do I look for in other people that lets them know and lets me know that I can trust them? So how do we put all of that together in terms of creating, first and foremost, a trusting professional relationship on which we can then build all of the great stuff that we talk about when we're talking about doing quality improvement? The next step on from there is to think about space. So creating trust requires us to have a little bit of space. This isn't something that you can do for 30 minutes on a Monday morning because we fitted it into our regular schedule. It's about creating space in all of our different interactions and meetings and schedules to be able to do this just as a core part of how we behave and who we are when we show up at work. So creating time and space for a different kind of dialogue. For some people, that means actually looking at my diary. And if I look at my diary and I say, my entire week is filled with meetings, and all of those meetings have formal agendas with people taking minutes and creating action plans, where do I really have the time and space to have a different kind of conversation? Where's the time and space for open dialogue that's not controlled by something formal like an agenda? So some of this is an invitation to kind of break the mold with that stuff and say, maybe we don't need a meeting. Maybe we just need a chat. Maybe we could just walk and get a coffee instead of sitting down for something that feels more formal. So creating that time and space for dialogue is huge. The response then is also huge. So as we kind of work through this and as you invite other people to participate with you in this kind of dialogue, your response is hugely important. And that's where we'll talk a little bit more about trust in a second. Authenticity is another big one. So I've been reading a lot of Brené Brown. I think she's amazing. I think a lot of people are big fans of her work. But the authenticity with which you approach this, your own willingness to show a little bit of your personal vulnerability and being willing to share a little bit of you with the people that you work with, so that we see each other as humans interacting in the workspace rather than anything else, is a hugely important point. And that links very closely to the next one around transparency. So this is about honesty and candor. It's not just about doing lots of positive things and everyone being lovely to each other all the time. Sometimes we need to have difficult conversations. But having those difficult conversations in a manner that's respectful, in a manner that's supportive and engaging and gives others the benefit of the doubt and isn't accusatory or negative in any way, then that's transparency at its heart. It's not just about the positive, it's about all the different things we need to talk about. And I mentioned it earlier around reliability, but the constancy here, this isn't a once a week activity. It's not something we do immediately before our appraisal. It's something that we have to have in our minds as we go into every single interaction, conversation, even before every email that we send. So really simple thing. Here's a common phrase that we say. We'll be in a conversation with someone at work and they'll suggest an idea, and quite often the response will be, yes, but. And that word but just flips it. It means, yes, but I'm just going to tell you what I think. I've heard what you say and I don't think it's important, so here's what I think. Change the word but to and. It's the simplest thing. So I know people that have auto-corrected but in their computers to the word and so that they can't do that anymore, which might be a little extreme. It might occasionally get people in trouble. But it's kind of powerful because what it means I'm saying then is, yes, I hear you and I can build on that. So what we're doing there is creating all of these different things, but just being consistent in that approach so that it doesn't matter who I'm talking to, whether it's Derek Feely as my chief exec, or project coordinators, or chief execs out in the system, or the patients that we work with, the behavior has to be consistent all the way through. The important thing about trust is that there's just no real magic bullet. You can't just make some grand statement around trust and say, okay, we all trust each other now. I promise you can trust me. Everything's fine. It would be so nice, but it's just not a reality. So the thing around trust is that it's earned gradually in these small moments, these minute interactions, and the tiniest thing can break it down to nothing. So being very cognizant of that is a huge step forward in terms of just showing people those little signals that let them know that they can help us. And one of the simplest ways to demonstrate trust and to show others that they can trust you is to ask for help. Now this gets harder and harder the more senior you are. The more senior you are, the more that you're expected to have all the answers. So our invitation is I guess, for you to see leadership and leaders, not necessarily as the people with all the right answers, but the people with all the right questions. So asking for help is a huge signifier of you can trust me because I'm willing to show that I don't have the answers to this. I want to know what you think. I'm inviting you into this conversation, into this experience. And so that is one of the really simple things that you can do, and just again, an opportunity to reflect. If you perceive asking for help as a weakness in yourself, or if you on occasion perceive it as a weakness in other people, it's worth just reflecting on that and how you could help others to be encouraged to feel safe and to feel secure to really ask for help as part of our daily work lives. It's a huge part of how we work as teams. And this is a list from one of the books that I think is a really helpful book. It's called The Trusted Advisor. The reference is on the bottom. And this just really talks about the things you need to do that really demonstrate trust. So this is getting to a little bit more to the practical, so the kinds of behaviours that we want you to be exhibiting here. So listening. Derek Feely will always say we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that proportion. So it's hard for someone like me who likes to talk a lot, but just stopping and listening for a second is actually the best thing you can do. Showing genuine empathy, really noticing what they're feeling and telling them that you're noticing what they might be feeling and checking that with them, having those kinds of conversations. Building a shared agenda that's not from one perspective or the other, but is very much joint. Taking a point of view. A huge detractor from trust is sitting on the fence. People really do want to know what you think, and it's okay to tell them what you really think as long as you do that in a positive way. So take a point of view and just be open and honest about that. Take personal risk, ask about other areas, ask really great questions. Questions like, there are lots of lists that are available around appreciative inquiry, just open questions that really allow people to talk and explore different things. Give away ideas, the generosity that goes with that, and relax your mind. Now, relaxing your mind sounds like a really simple thing to do, so there's another list of tips here, not as easy as you might think, in terms of how you could go about relaxing your mind. So this is about when you're in those moments that you are stopping and listening and thinking about them. So if you find yourself thinking about yourself, this second question, who am I thinking about? If I'm thinking about me, if I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner, if I'm thinking about something that's been bugging me or my next meeting, I'm not really there, and they're going to see that. So just being self-aware of some of these things and really noticing it. The phrase, I am not the center of the universe, is an important one for us all to bear in mind. Think about who you're serving, think about sort of whether you're sort of assigning blame in those situations, and think about what you might be afraid of. And this last point is really the basis of all of this cultural understanding, which is that knowing the truth is better than not knowing it. And it might be a really hard truth for us to hear, but that still has to be preferable to us and has to be what we're willing to seek out and find, rather than sort of wanting to exist in a situation where we assume that our culture is in line with our values and everyone's just treating each other just fine. So the bravery and the courage that it takes to really do that is a huge part of this. This is some work that was done by our European Leadership Alliance. So we have about 35 organizations from 12 different countries, and the leaders of those organizations come together on a regular basis. It's a wonderful network, and it's wonderful because it's informal, and it's about relationships. And they come together to talk about a lot of the big challenges that are facing healthcare at the moment, and how you really do improvement within the context of European healthcare right now. Now, the great thing about this network is that we're not just talking about outcomes, we're talking about them as leaders and how they show up at work. So this is what they created in terms of these are shifts we need to make, because right now as leaders, we behave in traditional ways that have served us for a very long time. And part of behaving in a way that supports a different kind of culture, part of being more positive around quality improvement, means not only that we need to add new behaviors, but we need to get rid of some of the old ones. So you'll have probably heard Maureen Bisognano talk about X-Novation. And we talk about X-Novation as an activity that's about removing waste from the system. So we're great at adding the next thing to do, the next checklist, the next sticker to go in sets of patient notes, the next field on an electronic health record. We're constantly adding to the system, and we're very rarely taking away the things that we added before that were intended to solve a problem but probably didn't. So X-Novation as a concept, I find very freeing. I think it's great. I think we should all be thinking about it all the time. What can we do less of that's not adding value? I also think it's really important in terms of behavior, though. So you can't just start behaving positively or in a different way that you think is going to be more supportive of QI unless you're willing to identify and stop the behaviors that might be detracting from QI and creating a different kind of culture that you might have wanted 5 years ago but might not be the culture that you want now. So the awareness of the shifts that we need to make, I think, is really vital. So where we talked about creating energy, we talked about the fact that right now everyone feels too busy for QI. It's a fight to find capacity and time and space and energy to do this work. So we need to make a shift in terms of our thinking around that, and then we need to make a shift in terms of practically how we deal with that. So let's stop doing hundreds and hundreds of audits that show us the same data every single month, and let's use that time instead for QI. So things like that that become quite practical. We talked about creating trust, but we talked about that being a shift from the command and control approach. So the distribution of leadership and really showing our teams, our staff, our patients, our families that we trust them. I mean, one of the most interesting things is when someone with diabetes gets admitted to hospital and they've been managing their insulin dosing at home for years and years absolutely fine, and they get into hospital and we take it off them and say, we can't trust you with that now. It's signaling a kind of culture that we probably want to change. The leading with humility piece, this shift away from heroism and the idea of one sole transformational hero leader that's going to solve all our problems is huge. And it creates this collective responsibility in terms of everything we talked about. Here I am showing up to work, and whoever I am in this organization, I have a role in creating the right kind of culture and contributing to the improvement work that we're trying to do. So the distribution of leadership comes with that. And you need to have ceded power in order to be able to do that. So this shift from authority, closely linked to the shift from command and control, is the next piece. Then there's pieces around ability, how we enable people to really do this, how we empower them, we give them the skills, the tools, the time, the permission, the expectation, as opposed to limiting their time and saying, well, yes, you can do all of that QI work, but you still have to do everything else you're already doing. So some of those shifts are really important. Celebration and joy in learning, as opposed to the negative impacts of trying to learn from failure, and some of the ways in which we've traditionally approached that are huge. This personal resilience piece I'm going to come back to, and then this piece around network. So the alliance that I described is a network of leaders who are all talking about these things in very open and candid ways. And when I talk about openness and candor for these leaders, I'm talking about this list of questions. So when they talked about their personal resilience, when they talked about what they wanted to create, it was fascinating that they were focused on other people. So they started saying, well, we need to empower everyone else. These are great leaders. They want to create fantastic cultures in their organizations that support QI. But they forgot to start with themselves. And as we got more deeply into the conversation, they started to say things, well, I really think it's important to demonstrate respect. I have huge respect for the people that I work with, but I actually don't know how good I am at demonstrating respect. And so what might I do around that? Or something around, I think I'm great when everything's going fine, but I'm aware I behave a little bit badly when things get really tough. So how do I show up in challenging moments that I'm going to need to adjust? So this room full of very senior leaders from all across these different countries sat in a room and said, this starts with me, and for me individually, there are aspects of this that I'm worried I'm not great at right now, and I want to improve that. And the power of that conversation, of them personally reflecting on how they create trust, how they demonstrate respect, how they form networks, how authentic they are, how they can actually create open spaces that, that encourage psychological safety and move away from command and control, was just the best conversation to be a part of. I thought it was amazing. And now they're all going through a process of asking themselves those questions and getting feedback from people, and then using it to drive improvement in their own behavior. So in a very practical way, they got from, here's a conceptual theory about this big framework, to what do I do differently when I go back to work tomorrow? And that, I think, is where we need to be at if we're really going to make shifts in this, if we're really going to change our behavior. This is a quote from Brené Brown. The most transformative and resilient leaders share these three characteristics. So this piece that's around curiosity and knowing their own emotions, their own thoughts, and their own behaviors. So that's exactly what I've just described in those leaders. This second piece around how those affect the relationships and the perception of those people when they show up at work. So this starts with me, and then it becomes about me interacting with other people, because I'm not an island, I'm part of a team. Whoever I am, whatever I'm doing, if you're working in this business, you're part of a team, probably part of many, many teams. So part of this is about the interaction. And this last piece is about discomfort and vulnerability. This stuff is hard. This stuff is uncomfortable to talk about. There's no action plan that's going to figure this out for us. These are not conversations we've traditionally made time for. This is not what the regulators are necessarily looking for us to be doing. But this is huge. And if we get this right, what we create is a culture that really empowers the improvement that ultimately has the impact in terms of the patient outcomes, the patient experiences, the families that are with those patients, and our staff as they all show up to work. So we're talking about trust and we're talking about these behaviours because we're all here to improve patient safety, and you can't do that if you don't really know what's going wrong and if you don't know what the good ideas are that are out there in order to solve those problems. So this piece around improving patient safety requiring a culture where people are psychologically safe to speak up when things are going wrong and suggest ideas in terms of how we make things better and to share learning. So that's really why we come back to this framework. And theoretically, all of these different component parts are needed, but practically, that starts with our individual behaviour whenever we show up to work. I'm going to hand over to Göran now, who's going to talk a bit more about that.
Thank you very much, Amelia. We have heard a fantastic presentation about framework and how to think about developing a culture for safety. And then I think we have heard 30 minutes about courage. And one of my life questions that I never will have an answer on, and I think it's a lot about courage, is how do people meet nowadays? I read in a paper that computer-assisted matching started as early as 1959, but the shift came in the mid-90s. And now there is no turning back. Matchmaking and online dating has become a big industry, and about 25% of all US couples now meet on the internet. I couldn't believe those figures. But I thought, maybe it's true. And I will never have that chance. And I'm not sure that I would have had the courage to find someone through internet. But isn't this what Amelia has talked about, all about courage? And where do we leave and forget what courage is all about? Can you please just stand up for 2 minutes and join me with this small person's ambition to show what fun is? No. Let's see what happens here. Can you help me? No, you cannot. Isn't it fantastic? I think that this guy is my hero. So I start every morning to see and look at that video and to see if I have a courage to help people to have compassion and love their work every day. Because I think that is so needed. Because we are leaving the world where it's about me and my ego, and we are approaching a world where it's much more about we and our ecosystem. In my region, Jönköping, we have tried to do this by completely change how we map our system. So we visualize our system instead in pictures where we focus on the social issues first and try to prevent as much as possible the problems that we know that we are here to support a solution on. And I think that we go from a curative, only a curative approach to a more preventive approach. And then we need new languages as from micro to macro, we need to leave the power to someone else. And we need to think in new placemaking. And I come back to what I mean with that. And we also need to become what I have learned from my son. We have to become ecovative. Now, Steve Svensson talked yesterday to the CEOs that participate in this conference, and he said that when team-based, person-centered work becomes a drug, it becomes a gateway of fulfillment. And for me, that summarized so well where I think we really need to go. And we have read about this in many articles over the years. Here is one where John Toussaint says that great leaders make us improve our culture if we can support willingness, humility, curiosity, perseverance, and self-discipline. But you know, I think Steve Svensson is coming much closer when he is saying, do we have a leadership that can answer positive in these questions? Does my leader appreciate me? Does my leader like my thoughts? Do I have a leader that is transparent? And do I have a leader that makes me feel included? If we really should move our culture, then I think that we need to be the persons that develop positive answers on these 4 questions. Why is it so important? Well, I believe that we live in a trap, a learning organization trap, because there is all the time a dynamic and the tension between the routine work that needed to be done and the time we need to have for reflection. And we also know that we need to move from routines that were previously important to innovative work and then to new processes that take time to make to new routines. And we understand that this all the time gives us a tension between how to really make the new world happening. So I've been thinking a lot, how can you visualize this problem? So I remember that when I was a little younger, I haven't done this for a couple of years, so I'm not sure how good I am any longer. I tried to learn how to, do you say jungle?
Juggling.
Jungle. And it was a hard lecture because, you know, when you do this and the ball starts to roll everywhere, what do you say to yourself? this will never work. And every time you say this will never work to yourself, you just add on that it will never become successful. So my way of learning this was really to find a place, a high bed, so I didn't have to reach out for the tennis balls. And just after 10 minutes, this was a way to live my yoga life, because you get very focused and very concentrated when you do this. Now, this symbolized for me what it takes to be a leader in a time where we should go from me to we, from ego to echo. We need to help both perspectives at the same time. We have, for example, my daughter Sofia, that tells me that when I studied political science and found in Mexico that when Mexico and United States and Canada produced the first NAFTA document, they also gave McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Burger King a free establishment in Mexico. And from that year, the diabetes problem and the overweight and the positive economy in these companies is the same curve. And she says to me, "Dad, this is structural violence, and you are part of that." Then my son Tobias tells me that you don't understand anything. He's an architect, and he says to me, you have to work with the room. You have to understand placemaking. You have to fulfill the room with new features so people can meet and establish positive relationships. And when I talk with his coming wife, I hope, she says to me, "Göran," her name is Johanna, Jojo, we call her, "you old people, you are so linear thinking. You have to be both linear, recycle thinking and circulate thinking at the same time. You need to learn how to use the balls in a better way." Why? Well, she is part of new research where they produce shoes and handbags for women through mycelium, and that's mushrooms. So the shoes and the handbags can become mushrooms again. But this is happening in our system right now. There is an American company named Ondu that plans for insulin dose recommendation and diabetes education at the same time in a cell phone. And they have the same type of development in Canada right now. We have another company in the United States that is called BioHealth that develops a software that can analyze the symptoms communicated by the user and give out a list of possible diagnoses and guide them toward the next step for them. Kaiser Permanente, they opened a medical school in 2020 with focus on data and virtual reality, and the school is designed to teach students how to use technology to deliver high quality care in new and collaborative ways. And it comes down to how should this world look like for my mother, 95 years of age. And still, last year, when we were planning her situation, the community came with one book, the primary care came with one book, and the hospital came with a third book of documentation of her life with them. And then I asked them, could I put all your notes together? No, you cannot. I believe we have to act into new ways of testing new processes. So, therefore, in my system, we have something we call living library. We have more than 50 individuals with experience of our processes that comes to any place where the professionals want to have a person with individual experience talking about what was important for them. We have, from this living library also developed coaches, and we have peers that comes and change our way of thinking. We have developed a concept that we call patient compact. So when we meet the patient, we want the patient to own what they can expect from our system. But that is tough, so we need to practice that in completely new ways. So we set up simulation labs where we ask the professionals and the patients from the living library and the peer work to work together and design how the process should look like. So we are leaving this kind of cinema sitting. We are building, place-making, new ways of working to minimize the risk that we are linear thinking. This has given us a completely new result because we can see that when we increase this patient compact idea and do it together, we see that more and more patients get their care transition quicker and quicker. And we can also see that this makes our hospitals less dependent on beds. We measure how satisfied the patients are, and we can see that in most aspects of participations perspectives, they get more and more satisfied. We develop now places where we can work together with the patients in completely different ways. We use theaters, we use walking rounds in the forest, we write referrals for physical training. We change the way of how we think that the autonomy of the patients develops. And we know that this sustains life and health in a completely new way. So we have dance for people with Parkinson, we have referrals for physical fitness, and we have readings and meetings with memories for other groups. If I now had talked of the individual change, the care transition, and the group change, we also try to help all our employees to get a better work situation, because we know that that develops a safe situation for them we are here for. And quite often we talk about how can we make the work meaningful, How can we reduce the risks that the physical work that our assistant nurses are doing, and how can we increase the joy at work? We do this because we know that 25% of European citizens will experience a mental health problem during their lifetime. We know that poor mental health due to stress is a significant and increasing, alarming increase of sick leave among young employees. So we believe that if we can encourage people to engage in their work, we also support the society in our system and region. We do this through 4 aspects. We talk a lot about need-driven improvement, so the improvement do not come top-down. It comes from what is important for the patient or the service taker that we have. We together develop knowledge about the subject and a similar understanding of the aims, and then we are very conscious to encourage the ownership of the change that is happening. We use the method of driver diagrams. You can look at that when you look into the PowerPoints. And we have seen that when we do this in an innovative approach, we also use the thinking of having a good structure of the improvement work, but we also talk to the agency approach, where fellowship learning seems to be a very good way. So parallel with supporting the improvement work in the daily work, we invite fellows from the same context to come and learn a little deeper about improvement. So we become, instead of somebody who tells how to do, we will become co-coaches to coaches that come from the reality we want to improve. We have good results on this, and people say that working with the 90 days model, with a strong structure of the innovative approach, and having the support from the senior management, the work environment becomes better and better. When I try to understand this and look into this, I think what we really do is developing individuals and teams that are more resilient. They accept suddenly situations beyond their control. They have come to terms with the fact that people, including themselves, make errors or wrong things, and they can act purposely towards a situation where they can change page if necessary. But it takes leadership that understands this. Now, Erik Holnagel, and a professor in safety in Australia, Galbraith. No, that's not his name. His name is Frank Brain.
Britt White. Britt White.
Say it again.
Britt White.
Good. I can say it now.
We're a team.
Good. Have written a lot about resilience, and they say that there are 4 things that we have to encourage people to. It is learning. Develop a culture where learning is in focus. Be transparent in the communication so people can have the courage, you remember the dancer, to respond. Help them to monitor We learned this morning not only with measures, use other methods to monitor also. And then suddenly people start to anticipate and see that it's fun with the future. And they don't have to have sons and daughters that tell their father that he doesn't understand. What the father understands nowadays is more that I think that some leadership philosophy is good when we talk about change and safety and culture. If you haven't met Parker Palmer, go into his books and read, because it's a mix of poesy and philosophy and leadership theory. And he says, we are all in this together. We need to appreciate the others. We have to hold tension to creativity. Put the sense of personal voice and agency in focus, and help the community to change. But remember, it doesn't happen all at once. There is no instant pudding. What there is one thing, and that is, if you as a leader always says where you come from and not talk about where you are heading. Because if you can talk about where you are coming from in a positive way, people understand that there is still hope to change the culture. Thank you very much.